have to say got it, thank you. Sudeep, I'll just go ahead and say next slide. This is a talk that no, go back for a second. This is the same talk I gave at a European Parliament meeting a few months ago, and the title is The Global Economy and the Anthropocene. So next slide, please. So I'm so glad to be talking to people in a business school. If there's anybody who's going to do anything practical, it's people with actual connections to the practical business world. So let's just start. The $120 trillion a year global economy is growing at about 3% a year before and post-COVID. So the global economy, this is just fundamental. The global economy links our nations in trade. It lifts millions from poverty. It's how we earn our livings and find much of our meaning. This, by the way, is surely true in India in the last 30 or 40 years. So much has happened, and you now have a flourishing middle class that you didn't have 40 years ago. But the same global economy is a juggernaut. It's driving climate change, a mass extinction, and wave after wave of pandemics as we invade habitats all over the world. The implications are obvious. If we keep growing at 3% a year, we will soon destroy the biosphere. Given that the economy is a juggernaut, it's not clear how we can slow it soon enough. 3, we may or may not have the means to slow the economy and meanwhile stay alive, and we only have a couple of decades. Next slide. Next slide, please, Sudeep. 5 years ago, I wrote down the equation below. I'll tell you what I was trying to think about. Naresh, I was up at our home on Crane in the San Juans, and I thought, suppose you have an economy, and at time t, it has MT things in it, the central MT. What will be in the economy in the next period? Well, if you have MT things that work, say 40 things that work, in the next period, keep the 40 things that work. But then I thought, but of course you can innovate. You could take any one thing and make something new out of it, like a hefted axe head. You could take any pair of things and make something new out of it, like the printing press. You could take any 3 things and make something new out of it. You could take any 4 things out of 40 and make something new, like the Wright brothers airplanes that puts 4 parts together, an airfoil, a bicycle wheel, a gas engine, and a propeller. So this equation has something so simple, and I just wrote it down and I didn't think much about it. It turns out it's a completely novel equation. So what it is saying is, in the next period, you'll have what you have now, and then you now just perform the sum of this little alpha 1, which decreases with I. Alpha 1 is saying how hard it is to make something new out of I things. So MT is 40, and you take 1 out of 40. But then you take any pair out of 40s, or any triplet out of 40s, or any 4-set out of 40s. Well, that term, MT choose I, goes up very fast as I increases. And it does quite remarkable things. There's no death term in this equation. I'll tell you about that in a moment or later. Next slide, please. So here's what this equation that I wrote down. We think it explains why we're in the Anthropocene. First of all, there's a hockey stick behavior. The systems, if you start with 20 things, and for some fixed set of the other parameters, there's a glacial growth in the number of things. Then all of a sudden, there's an explosive growth approaching infinity at finite time. It's not exponential, it's much faster than exponential, it's hyperbolic. My colleagues and I, namely Roger Koppel, an economist in the United States, think this explosion upward is the Anthropocene now. A theorem due to Andrew Little shows that every time you add a new item, the waiting time to add the next new item is cut in half. So if it would take 1,000 years, then it takes 500 years, then 250 years, or a month, a day, blah, blah. This explains it's the great acceleration. So we're actually explaining the great acceleration. Explode or crash. If you put in a first order loss term, just minus mu, saying that any one thing could just disappear with a probability of, say, 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a million, this is astonishing, and it's going to bear on public policy. If this death term is increased from 0, the process either explodes to infinity or it crashes to nothing in finite time. There's huge implications that are unknown for macro and economic policy aiming to slow economic growth. It turns out there's an unstable manifold between exploding or dying or crashing, and there's no clue whether you're going to explode or crash as things are going on. It's very mysterious. So TAP then explains the gradual and explosive differentiation from simple to complex goods. Our current economy ranges from needles to space stations. It didn't 80,000 years ago. And TAP also explains a power law descent distribution of patents and technology. This one equation explains completely different distributions. It's quite surprising, and it seems important. Next slide. So I'm now going to show you some wonderful old artifacts. This is a bifacial stone made by Australopithecus about 2.6 million years ago. It's a 16-year-old girl, and it's a bifacial hacked stone flake. So, we branched off from the rest of the great apes around 3 million years ago. Australopithecus is in South Africa and Africa around 2.5 million years ago. And we're the first species that makes shaped stone tools. At the beginning, we had a few stone tools like this, 5 or 6 or 7 for different uses like prying or scraping, but not much different, very few different tools and very few differentiations into simple and complex things. Next slide. So we then get to Homo erectus, then Homo habilis, then Homo sapiens with Neanderthal. Neanderthal evolved around 500,000 years ago. We emerged around 300,000 years ago. This is around 30,000 years ago in the south of France. The Cro-Magnon of 40,000. Look at the gorgeous, exquisite pressure flake stone tools. They're just amazing. But it took a couple million years to get to the point of these stone tools. I want you to bear in mind that as far as we know, we are genetically the same and intellectually as powerful now as we were 300,000 years ago. So look at the slow accumulation of technology, and then we'll get to the last few centuries. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. So this is the Great Wall of China, which is around, I keep forgetting if it's 500 BC or AD, but look at the technology we had by then. So the Cro-Magnon probably had a few hundred tools, including the Atlatl. Mesopotamia probably had a few thousand tools. The Chinese probably had many thousands of tools, 500 AD. Next slide. This is us now. Those are some Russian cosmonauts in the space station a few years ago. So the number of different tools and the differentiation into simple and complex creeped upwards slowly, that exploded a few hundred years ago. Next slide. That's our planet at night. Here we are worrying about wasting energy, and that's our planet at night. It didn't look like that 400 years ago, right? And why are the lights on all over the planet? India is a little bit better than most, but why are we leaving the lights on at night? Next slide. So Roger Koppel, some years ago, took a look at the behavior of the TAP equation. He said, my God, it looks like the Industrial Revolution. So this is fine data on world GDP rather, for the last 2 millennia. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. That's GDP in constant dollar terms. And it's essentially flat from 2,000 years ago. In fact, it's essentially flat from 200,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago. And you see what's happening. It explodes upward and it's going up nearly vertically. It really is. It's so striking to me to look at that. That's global GDP. That curve is not an exponential, it's hyperbolic. And it's now soaring upward. To look at it is to say we're on a finite planet. Does anybody think we can keep doing it? And the answer is, of course we can't. So the first thing is, whatever the theory says, just look at that slide. This is the culmination of 300,000 years of our technological evolution. And it's being driven upward by the TAP process, which I'll show you in the next few slides. Next slide. So this is using TAP with some just some parameters, and it does exactly the same thing. And the reason is the following. To give you the intuition, it has to do with tinkering and jury rigging. It's very homely. Suppose there's something broken in your house, a leak in the ceiling, and you go to the garage and you want to find something to fix the leak with. Suppose there's only one thing in the garage, a broken plumber's helper. Or suppose there's a few hundred broken things in the garage. It's easier to jury rig if you've got a lot of things with which to jury rig, right? That's the TAP process. And that's why this has exploded upward. It's easier and easier to innovate now. It was very hard to innovate 50,000 years ago. It's trivial to innovate now. I've got about 12 patents. Anybody can invent, which is wonderful. So TAP fits and is the first explanation for how we got from a few thousand goods, a few dozen goods, to billions of goods now with a hockey stick behavior. And that's it. Next slide. So we don't think we're impacting the planet. I am old enough to remind you at 82 and a half, I was born as World War II started. This is plastic. Plastic did not become popular until the 1960s. We won World War II with no plastic. You can see what it is. It's an enormous mound of plastic crap. And we deny that we're doing anything to ravage the planet. And look at that. There's plastic all over the ocean. There's plastic that's killing fish. There's plastic that's getting into your veins, and this stuff lasts 10,000 years. And we think it's an economic advantage, and we think we've done something technologically wonderful. Well, look at it. Now try to get rid of plastic. When I was a kid, the milkman came with a glass bottle of milk. Next slide. Okay, so these are measures of the Anthropocene, and you can see what they're doing. They're rocketing upward on all of the things that they're measuring. Next slide. Next slide, please, Sudeep.
Yeah.
So, fine. So let's get some lessons from TAP. We really are in the Anthropocene. It's a hockey stick, glacial and explosive growth, approaching infinity for the continuous equation in finite time. The discrete equation doesn't, it just rushes up faster and faster. That's the Anthropocene now. We're destroying the biosphere. The striking thing that Andrew Little showed is that each new item added cuts the waiting time to add the next new item in half. The great acceleration. We're destroying the biosphere ever more rapidly. So something we have to do is, in some sense, we have to slow economic growth. Even to say that is grotesque. We live for economic growth. Every politician says we have to restore GDP growth. And after all, it's wonderful. It lifts millions of people out of poverty, but it's destroying the biosphere. So the problem is, how and what way can we possibly control that? I now want to come to this issue that the top process explodes or crashes. There's this first order death term, minus u, so minus mu. So as mu is increased from 0, the process, at 0, the process explodes, but then as you raise mu up and up and up, mu is just the probability that things disappeared each period, like 1 in a million or 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100. All of a sudden, there's a transition. It's a phase transition, and it crashes to nothing. So this is really important because there's unknown implications for macroeconomic policy in an attempt to slow economic growth. Let me try to explain this. This is really serious. Do we really know for sure that TAPS applies to the economy? No, it probably does. This loss term is, to explain it again, the chance per period that anything disappears. It could be 1 in a million or 1 in 1,000. So suppose that we come out of COVID and we want to restore growth, but slower growth. Well, just one way of slowing growth is to raise interest rates. Now, suppose we try to do a slow, so that we grow more slowly and carefully. If we try to do it by something like raising interest rates, the loss term will go up, right? Because more companies will fail, and failures can crash across the economy with phase transitions and all of that we're not even talking about yet. So at some point, there will be a threshold collapse. Will there be warning signs or not? The results from my colleagues is there's no way to tell that you're crossing the threshold. If that's right, how in the world do we do policy? Another one of my colleagues, well, both of them, but Abby Devereaux has written a paper, and she points out the following. Your policymakers, this is real. We don't know if we're going to crash, and the great acceleration means the future is rushing at us faster and faster and faster. Every time we add a new item, the waiting time to the next new item is cut in half. The implication is, if there's a delay in the effectiveness of a policy, say of 7 years or 3 months, eventually the system is changing faster than we can make and implement policy decisions. Abby's right, assuming this is even roughly right. So we confront something that is huge. The economy can't keep growing at this rate and the way that it is. We have to find a way of somehow taming it. We have to feed 7.7 billion people. We need to have our ways of earning our livings. And we're seeing here stuff that we have no macroeconomic theory about. If these TAP issues are correct, how will we know that we're crossing a threshold to collapse or not? And the waiting time to implement our policy is finite, and the system may change faster than we can implement our policies. We know almost nothing about what I'm saying to you people now, because this theory is very new. Should we be cautious that it actually applies to the world? Absolutely. But there's a reasonable chance that it does. How would we know? And how would we possibly figure out what to do? My sense is we need new, careful macroeconomic theory that isn't part of current economics, which is still macroeconomics policy is still based on microeconomic policy, which is still Arrow de Breu and competitive equilibrium. It won't work for any of this. Competitive equilibrium is almost useless once you try to understand the build out of an economy in Brian Arthur's terms, precisely for the reason that Andrea Rolli and I wrote. You cannot deduce the new goods and services that will come into existence. You cannot write equations for the specific evolution of either the biosphere or the economy. So we are living in face of a radical uncertainty in what I call the adjacent possible. We don't even know what is in the adjacent possible of what can happen next. The implication is we don't know the sample space of the process. So we don't have a probability measure. We can't even define random. That's all part of the world is not a theorem. It's terrifying, but wonderful. We're in a radical new world. I believe we're at a third transition in science. And we're living it now, and we're destroying the biosphere. So there is at least a couple of hopes. The TAP process is enormously creative. It's so easy to invent now that we can try to create a decentralized global inventiveness or a global creative commons to find ways to live stably of nature, not above nature. It's so easy to invent now that the major policies that I could think we should talk about is how do we implement invention all over the planet in small local groups? For example, small farming groups or small communities in India or the United States in soil restoration. We could stop here, or I could just leave some time for me to tell you about hopes for soil. I'll just begin with this. John Crawford is a new friend at the University of Glasgow. John points out that if we restored the soil, we would sequester all the carbon dioxide we need to, we'd store water and we would increase productivity of the soil. So one place to try to have a global creative commons is trying to find out around the globe how to do effective polyculture with shorter supply chains and local sales, which is what we were doing 300 years ago. So perhaps we could come back to that. I think there's a last slide. Well, that's it. The issues are global, civilization, existential, and scale. Homo sapiens is vastly out of balance with the planet. So we have to have a global conversation, and I'm glad we're having part of it now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stu, for that quick, what else can I say, but global sweep of the ideas, starting from the time of life and its evolution to where we are. So I was going to have a few questions, interaction with you.
Sure.
But before I do that, there will be others here that have questions that even I want to listen to. So before I ask a few questions, I would, and of course I want to mention at some point the very exciting research that you and Sudeep are engaged in at the moment. But we'll come back to that. But let me open up the floor maybe now, and you and I can have a chat later on if we get through all the questions. I'm sure there would quite a few of them. So who would like to start?
Sudeep,
Yes,
Sudeep,
thank you.
1 second, if I may. Before we start, we really have global problems. There really is the possibility of global creative commons that I and others are thinking about. There really is the possibility of making things happen in India. You really are a group that's looking at spiritual, practical issues. And Sudeep, I mean, Naresh, just possibly as a follow-on to this initial conversation, it makes sense to do something that are further conversation. Anyway.
Indeed, and to talk about that, I have come to the conclusions to that the answers are not going to be found in traditional policy work and in traditional economic thinking. I spent 3 decades trying to sort of divorce, economic growth from consumption.
Excuse me, Naresh,
Yeah.
you might have to mute people who are interrupting.
Yeah.
Everyone should be on mute when one person is speaking.
Yeah, that's true. We will look for that, and I'll ask maybe Sudeep or Chester, who's with us, or Divya, whoever has that. Okay, I think
IT can do that.
So IT can help us. All right. So yes, Stu, I was just saying that, and therefore, that's why we started the Center on Complexity Economics, quantum-like modeling and applied spirituality to look in an alternative way at many of these issues. And we'll talk a little bit about that research in a while, but let me get others to come in with questions as they like, including a new economic constitution.
I think
Who would like to start?
I think Annie-Louise had some interesting points. Annie-Louise has joined us. So
Yeah. Annie-Louise, you want to make an intervention? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, and great to see you again, Stuart. It's been several years. Yes, I so appreciate your thoughts, and I mean, it's daunting. Yeah, it's daunting when you really see what we're up against ourselves, right? And we have to learn how to make complexity work, really. So I've just put here in the chat some experimentations that are going on. I'm part of both organizations. One is R3.0, where they're working on a new economics based on thresholds and allocation. So the question is then really, what are the ethics of the new economics? And that has to be taken into account into sustainability data that are context-based. And not only that, if thresholds and allocations to understand what is a fair distribution as well, both resources, opportunities, but also responsibilities, if those are not embedded within the economic feedback loops that also then feedback, of course, to policy, then we're never going to get there. And then, so the argument that they are making in that organization and they came out of, Ralph Thumb came out of GRI, and this is where he was working before, and Bill Bauer, these are the two economics were working there. So that might, give some interesting perspective. And the other one is indeed something that I've been very closely involved with as one of the lead architects, and that is the CEASP Constitution. So there we have been working on how do we biomimic and cosmomimic the cosmological or informational architecture of living systems now, in the way that we design for governance and finance and economic models for regeneration and thrivability. And that means therefore creating different algorithms as well, based on DAOs, so decentralized autonomous organizations, but then with a human touch. So sometimes we call them DHO rather than DAO or DAO. And then by design, really encouraging behaviors and rewarding behaviors, that help us to understand the critical planetary boundaries and social thresholds as well, and carrying capacities, and rewarding not just staying within the boundaries of the carrying capacities, but also caring capacities. So there are completely different design principles based on that, very different affordances and attractors as well. And there is also a global commons in this new currency system. So we've been working on the creation of a new regenerative currency as well, digital currency, and one that can maintain its value in terms of how value is created across the ecosystem and again shared and distributed in the ecosystem. Now, all of this is experimentation, but it is starting to give also some concrete resources for people on the ground. It may, for people in India also be, I think, very, very interesting. In South America, there are also financing people who are working with organic farming and lots of other initiatives. So it's worth exploring this. And I think that's, so my question to you, Stuart, would be, from this adjacent possible, it seems that there are adjacent possibles of the kinds that we don't want. And there are the adjacent possibles that we could say is our next evolutionary step as a humanity to come to really a critical understanding as a species, how boundaries and context can actually help us to grow and develop, rather than having this mentality of always needing to exceed those, which is that old frontier mentality. So I would like to ask you, what do you really see also in terms of our own approach and our understanding as a humanity for getting the adjacent possible, attracting that possibility into the kind of trajectory where we would want to go as a humanity?
This is all quite wonderful to hear. In this last material you're talking about with South America and agriculture, is this material written up? And I would very much like to see it.
Yes. I've
Would
put
you-
it in the Constitution is here in the link. I can also follow up with an email. I will put also yeah. You want me to send it via email to you?
Yes, please send it by email, but let me make some connections. Do you know the name Andrew Zhang, or do you know it, Naresh?
No, I don't recall that.
Andrew has become a quite good friend. He is part of the group of us who's thinking about soil restoration. And Andrew is in Singapore. He's a central banker for years and years, quite high up, and working with a number of economists about how to deal with where we are. Andrew is also thinking about making a digital currency based somehow on the biosphere, and I only partially understand it on a low. So with your permission, may I put you in touch with Andrew and see where that conversation goes?
Yes,
Okay, he's really quite wonderful. He grew up, of course, in what I just lost it. Anyway, I'll find it again. So we're trying to start this soil. And can I take a moment now and tell you about the soil things that we're trying to do? It's going to fit in perfectly. And yeah, so this is going to take a few minutes, but it's worth it. I've gotten into it by accident. I trained in medicine. John Crawford at the University of Glasgow approached me about 7 or 8 months ago. He told me if we could restore the soils, it would sequester the CO2 that we need to. And a group of us have now been talking for 6 or 8 months. There is a scientist who I hope I will meet in a few days, not far from me. His name is Dr. David Johnson. I'll have dinner tonight with his younger colleague, Patrick. And here's what he's done. This is quite amazing. He, about 10 years ago, started making compost by taking about a 470 gallon steel tank or metal tank, and you put plant material into it, that's leaves and stuff, and some horse manure, and you let it sit for 18 months. Not a month or two, 18 months. And at the end of that, you get out a compost called BEAM compost. His claim is, and I'm waiting to see the detailed data, that something like a kilogram of this on a hectare, a pound on an acre, marvelously restores the soil. Well, that's a very small amount, and he's near here. So another young friend of mine, E-Blocks, started 2 years ago. I was up in our summer home on the San Juans, Naresh, and Ebe has made 10 such systems on his home or in his home around 4 miles from here. And they've been maturing now for 22 months. So Ebe has an enormous amount, like about 2,000 pounds of this material. And now the question is what to do with it. So here's what's happening. We've been dreaming about forming collectives of small numbers of farmers locally who could try experiments and share the information with one another. Northern New Mexico is strangely good about this. And Ebe has put together, because he knows everybody, 12 local groups of people, including people on Indian reservation, on the Pueblos, and Native Americans and Hispanics and whatever. And we've just put in a grant for an enormous $15,000 from Santa Fe, which would be lovely. The main thing is we're starting to talk to one another. And tonight we're meeting and saying, okay, how do we get Ebe's material out to 80 or 90 people in northern New Mexico? Who else can Ebe send it to? But meanwhile, there's about 100 or so of these bioreactors going up in the United States and beginning in Europe and elsewhere. They're trivial to build. So Andrew Zhang is from Borneo, and he's in touch with people in Borneo. So can we get the material to him? Now, pause. Why 18 months? You wind up with a compost that's predominantly fungal rather than microbial, Annalise, these things have, these critters have co-evolved with one another for almost 2 years. What has happened to them? My bet is they've co-evolved and learned how to live with one another. So we are starting with some friends in Holland and in Scotland, the idea of studying the genetics of soil, fungal material plant biosystems. Well, we don't know a lot about it. There's another amazing thing that's falling into place. I met a young man a few days ago named Cole Mathis. So just hear the science. Cole took, you can do metagenomic analysis of this material, and you see that there's thousands of this and that. Cole and others has done the following thing. Please pause and take it in. I now have 800 species in a community. Cole knows all of the enzymes encoded by all of the species around. For every enzyme, he knows the substrates and products of that reaction. So he is able to construct from the actual data all the substrates, all the products, and all the enzymes. And you get this vast connected picture. It's the metabolome of a community. Well, we can study it. Meanwhile, Eve's system is, it's not Eve's system, it's David Johnson's Sioux bioreactor. The idea is to get underway this spring, not 7 years from now, at low cost, making groups of people, for example, our 12 groups here, who start doing experiments now with this material and ask things like, does it really help or doesn't it help, under what conditions or not? But most particularly, can we evolve towards finding polycultures like corns, beans, and squash, which are mutualists and you don't need fertilizer and you get higher yield. So that, and then the idea globally is to ease our way towards local polyculture, where you don't have to send everything around the globe. You have short supply chains, you have greater food stability and greater stability, and make a global creative commons out of thousands of people around the planet doing experiments to find out what grow well where they are. So that's sort of, I think it could be done. I think it could be done in the next year. And I don't think it's going to take billions of dollars. I think it might take a couple million. And there's more. Some of you know about combinatorial optimization. Annalise, are you familiar with this? So, so here it is. So 10 years ago, my friends and I at the University of Vermont did the following thing. We were testing whether or not randomized clinical trials work, you know, standard randomized clinical trials. And one of our team, Jeffrey Horbar, said, okay, let's do that. But so the idea is that we want to find something, some good combination out of 10 things. It might be stuffs, it might be procedures, it doesn't matter. So we tried something that Horbar was working on. It was then called creative improvement or quality improvement commons. So hear it, this is quite remarkable. So you have 100 hospitals and you break them into 10 groups of 10 hospitals, called a team. So one thing is to do randomized clinical trials, and we can make the payoff landscape, you know, single peak like Fujiyama or multi-peak. You get multi-peak landscapes because of conflicting constraints. It's learning by doing in economics. So Jeffrey Horbar said, let's see if this quality improvement stuff works better. So the way we did it 10 years ago is you've got 10 teams, each with 10 hospitals. Each hospital in each team, you're all trying to do something, like find good combinations of whatever. And each of the teams does something slightly different. And they coordinate internally and then share among the groups. So within our group of 10, I check with everybody else in my group and I say, gee, you guys are doing better than me with respect to what? And this is astounding, based on anecdotal evidence, not statistically significant evidence. I say, oh, Annalise and her people have just done something. It looks better. I'm going to try that. And almost informally, it radically outperforms randomized clinical trials. And it's what humans have been doing for 50,000 years. I'll make my case in a moment. So what this means is we can create a platform that allows people to share the data, do the experiments, and solve problems with one another. And one name for it now It's a distributed peer learning networks. They don't exist yet. How expensive can they be? John is working with a set of 10 major corporations in Europe, like BASF and Bayer. They're interested in supporting this. They're involved with trying to get Europe be carbon neutral by 2030. To my astonishment, they're talking about side benefits like biodiversity. So they are really getting interested in supporting this peer learning network, and they're able to be in touch with 60 million farmers. So something can happen. Something can happen soon. My own sense about it is that we're just sensible about it, and we don't demand hundreds of millions of dollars. We just get organized and do it. That's it.
So if we can, let me just mention, before I turn to Professor Sudarshan, who has his hand up, we have in India a mystic and a spiritual teacher who has become really popular across the world now. And he is also into the Save the Soil movement. And he has now a tremendous movement, a large movement. And they are working on the same issue of Save the Soil. Combining of forces might really make magic. But that's something.
I agree.
Yeah.
Everybody, what's wonderful about saving the soil is everybody can fall in love with it.
Exactly.
How can you not fall in love with saving it? There's also a woman in India who's famous about soil and farming. Is it Vishna? You will know her. I don't have her name right.
We could find out. We could find that out. But let me let's turn to our Dean, Professor Sudarshan, for his comment or question. Go ahead, Sudarshan. You're muted, Sudarshan. You're muted.
Yeah, I just want to firstly thank Professor Stuart Kauffman for this, absolutely brilliant presentation in a very short span of time. And the importance is that, we all talk about this in a commonsensical way, but to say that, look, if you look at it rigorously, if you look at it to the extent that you can come up with an equation, there is a certain element of certainty and confidence that generates. So it's not like casual talk that we may have over a dinner table about the world going to dogs. So this kind of work is terribly important because it has this solid foundation of analysis and thinking, and it has great persuasive ability, persuasive power for, I would say, intelligent policymakers. Not all policymakers are intelligent, but those who are will sit up and take notice. So it's first thing. My concern is about what are we up against? See, whenever we talk about eliminating poverty, do this, that, open a bank account, directly transfer money to the poor, that will work better than giving them, rations and food, all of that. We are all the time talking about mitigating, alleviating poverty. But we don't seem to pay enough attention to what's really happening. What's really happening is poverty is constantly being produced. So if poverty is going to be produced at a faster rate than it's being alleviated through public policy programs, you're never going to eliminate poverty. Now, what do I mean by poverty being produced? Let's take soil, right, which we are talking about now. There are vested interests in the fertilizer industries and in governments which own fertilizer factories to keep selling this stuff, right?
Yep.
To tell farmers that you will never be able to make a living, you will not survive if you don't buy our fertilizers, and if you don't buy our great seeds that will give you hybrid yields. Now, I have to say that in India, Professor Swaminathan, who was part with Norman Borlaug created the Green Revolution in the country. He now realizes that, the premises on which the Green Revolution was based, which is intensive cultivation, high use of fertilizer, high use of water, are all have finished the soil, right? They've
Right.
completely damaged it.
We destroyed
Now
the
Yes,
topsoil.
and destroyed it. So now he realizes that, you need to think of a new way whereby you have what he calls an evergreen revolution, rather than just this green revolution that produced a rise in incomes and gave India self-sufficiency in grains. But then we've got enormous problems as a result. The problem is, so one lesson of the Green Revolution is that you can persuade farmers to change whatever they do, right? Now, so therefore, that lesson is important. If farmers now think that the only way they can make ends meet is by using fertilizers and growing water-intensive crops, it's possible to demonstrate to them an alternative whereby, their incomes needn't be drastically reduced and they could maintain some reasonable standard of living. And that will save. So farmers care about the soil more than anybody else. None of us in this, Zoom will care about the soil as much as farmers. Now, the thing to do is to come up with demonstrations for them, because they live in a very precarious situation. They live well off, particularly farmers in where my university is located, Haryana, and then the neighboring state, Punjab. Standard of living of farmers is good, but it's precarious. Overnight, there could be a drought, there could be some disaster, and they'd be in utter poverty. So it's this precariousness of their existence, which means that we need to be, they're very risk averse. And therefore, whenever we do anything, we need to demonstrate that we are talking about something that works. Now, we have attempted this, but there isn't a serious understanding in policymakers that we need to do this. Now, I don't know, it's easier to convince farmers, but it's not easy to convince policymakers who are in the thraldom of companies that make fertilizers and that want certain products. Lay's, chips want a certain kind of potato to be grown, and they don't want anything else to be grown. And to grow that kind of potato, they prescribed what fertilizer, water you need to use. So we are up against multinational corporations. We are up against big, powerful interests that have, a lot to gain by this myopic stance at which we are in. Now, how to counter that is an agenda that we need to think about, because there are too many spoilers.
Can I say yes? So thank you. I have, so the group of us is thinking about some ideas. Let's just do some, if I may, just do some exploring. Globally, we have monoculture. Farmers face global commodity prices. A friend of mine who was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford with me inherited a farm, and he faces commodity prices. The commodity prices are global, they can fluctuate, and he can do nothing about it. It's not only weather, it's the fluctuations of that. And we have food instability. So I've been thinking now for about a year, what if we could, well, let me just tell you a story. About 40 miles north of Santa Fe, there's a couple and they have about 50 acres, and they set aside 2 acres, not to do monoculture, but to do polyculture. And they grew stuff that they sold in Santa Fe and Taos, and they made $170,000 a year. So you can do it if you can sell the stuff in a local market. There is a farmer named Gabe Brown, he faced the following about 10 years ago. He was doing monoculture farming. He was going broke. The neighboring farmers were waiting to buy up his property. In 1 year, he read Thomas Jefferson's accounts of farming in Monticello. In 1 year, he shifted to polyculture, and he's surviving and doing brilliantly. And he's now lecturing all over the place. We want to reach out to him when we know what we're talking about. So point one is it's possible in a world of monoculture and global markets to actually just change and do polyculture and sell locally. So part of the dream is the following combination. Go to farmers and say, okay, do your monoculture stuff, but set aside a modest number of acres, shift to polyculture, join a group of local farmers who test out local combinations of conditions to do that polyculture well, seeking corn, beans, and squash, mutualists where you won't need fertilizer, and just start doing it. Now, meanwhile, we've got Monsanto. What happens? Let me just say it. What happens to Monsanto if 10 years from now, there's 10,000 groups of farmers around the planet trying to find good combinations of seeds and plants for their exact local environment. And they keep finding interesting new combinations of plants that help one another, as in the seed bank in Norway. Well, Monsanto can't compete with 10,000 people doing 100,000 experiments. It just can't. What would Monsanto do? Well, they want to make money. Instead of trying something as stupid as cloning a gene, where it will then turn out that there's a plant that's evolved that avoids a Roundup Ready and the cows love the plant, just Monsanto and the other seed companies could start making the seeds that people around the planet find in 10,000 different varieties to help local communities. The people themselves could store their own seeds, which we've been doing for 10,000 years. There's a blunt phrase in English, and one of them starts with an F. Just shut up and execute. If we start, we don't brag about it. We start under the radar and just start making it happen. If it's successful, and the local farmers in India or in northern New Mexico or in Nebraska can in part sell in local stores like farmers markets around the planet and make a living selling in farmers markets for part of their income. If it works, people will gradually shift to polyculture all around the globe. And we won't have to ship everything all over the globe. We'll grow it locally. The transport costs are enormous. We're selling grain from halfway around the world. Well, partly we'll have to. We have one kind of banana now in the United States. You know how stupid. There's dozens of kinds of bananas. Everybody would love to be able to go and get polyculture and food variety. The reason we don't have it is that we went to being standardized because of the Green Revolution. So, that's I'm passionate about it, Naresh.
Yeah, I know, Stu. Let's try to get in a few more. Sudeep, and then I really like to get a response from Professor Gandok as well. Pawan, this is a lot of beating up on business, so it'll be great to have a response from you after we hear from Sudeep. Go ahead, Sudeep.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Stuart and I have been discussing about these issues, related issues, I should say. There are quite a few things we have been discussing. One is more into the scientific side of it, which perhaps Stuart can touch upon later. But the other one is very much important for the complexity modeling itself. So understanding the complex adaptive systems. As Stuart has been working for a long time, I would be very interested to know from him also that his concept of basically understanding the complexity is in a way very much different from what we understand generally by computational models and the so-called ecological view. Because you see that if we don't bring in this adjacent possibles and also deep uncertainty in the economy and try to then kind of see that what kind of modeling may describe that better, then we are not really very much different from the standard neoclassical paradigm. Though we say that we are different, moving away from the general equilibrium model, etc. But somehow or the other, we have to bring in affordance, we have to bring in adjacent possible, and we definitely have to bring in deep uncertainty. And I think that that is a very important area in which complexity economics or complexity modeling, as well as quantum-like modeling, which we are working for some time, they can really join hands. Because you see that quantum-like modeling has been in a way designed mainly to understand how human behaves or how cognition happens under deep uncertainty. And I think that there can be a very good link between what all the things that we are talking about, because they are more practical sides of it. And then certainly quantum-like modeling can kind of link up with the complexity modeling to make it like more realistic. And that would be a great input to the policymakers also, if there are some listeners. And also say, for example, Stu was mentioning about the commodity prices and the fluctuations in commodity prices. Now, I know that there is some brilliant works going on in that direction, again, from the perspective of quantum-like modeling. Some people like, say, Belal Baki, who was actually at Santa Fe earlier, and now he has moved somewhere else. He's very senior now. So he has done a lot of work in understanding commodity price fluctuations through the lens of this kind of modeling. So maybe that from that perspective also, that can really be a good input to policy making. So I'd like to know about Stu's reflections on this.
Golly, I think that let me tell you what I would say if we had a little more time. Sudeep, have I sent you this paper that we haven't published yet, the third transition in science?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me say something very briefly about it. Andrea and I published The World is Not a Theorem. We put it up online a year ago, January. It got published this November in Entropy. The basic thing is to understand that you really cannot deduce new adaptations. So let me just say it in about a minute and a half, because others want to talk, and a hand is raised, and it's surely his turn. So just think about an engine block in a car. So what can you do with an engine block? This has to do with affordances. Well, you can drill some holes in it and make an engine. Having made the holes, you could store some wine in the cylinders. But an engine block is big and rigid. You could use it as the chassis of a tractor. And it took me several years of hard thinking to realize you can use an engine block as a paperweight. It's a great paperweight. Then here's what dawned on me about a year ago. The engine block has sharp corners. Can you use an engine block to crack open a coconut? Well, sure. Here's now the odd realization. If you're now using the engine block as a paperweight, can you deduce that you can use it to crack open coconuts? No, you can't. And this is fundamental. It is that any physical thing can be used for more than one purpose. And in general, you cannot deduce the different uses from one another. That's what happens in evolution all the time. They're called Darwinian pre-adaptations. And what happens in technological evolution all the time. And in policy evolution, a law can be used for different purposes, and you cannot deduce it. This means something profound. So Andrea and I are trying to publish our paper called The Third Transition in Science. It means we cannot make mathematical models of the way the biosphere or the economy evolves and makes new uses of extant things. So we're going to have to give up Newton. We really are.
Yeah.
Wonderful Newton. We cannot do Newton. We can't do Newton for the evolving biosphere or econosphere. We really are at a third transition in science. So Andrea and I have resubmitted it to Nature. There's some faint hope that they will publish it. The physicists will hate this, but they can't find me. I'm hiding in Santa Fe. Anyway, that's really important, Sudeep, and you're pointing to it. if you think in terms of affordances, this idea from around 30 years ago from, I've forgotten the man's name, you cannot deduce the different affordances or uses of things. That means we can't use the mathematics that we've been taught we can use by Newton.
Yeah.
Namely, you have a fixed phase space and you deduce trajectories in that phase space. No,
Yeah.
the whole thing won't work. But anyway, just that. So, but meanwhile,
let me see before I go back to Sudarshan. Let me see if Pawan, would you want to give us a little input here?
Thank you, Naresh. That's very kind of you. I think, first of all, it's fairly onerous for one little Sodarji to try to represent the entire world of business. But I do think Stuart's just most recent remarks actually both serves, his earlier remarks obviously serve as the platform, burning platform for call to action. But his most recent remarks also serve as the potential source of inspiration. And I'm sort of very interested, Stuart, in your thoughts about once you conclude that trying to slow GDP down is not really going to be as effective. But I'm sort of wondering whether that should even be an objective. Whether we just need to find, given some of these other examples that you were talking about, whether we just need to find more sustainable energy sources for this enormously complex system that is, that has evolved and is continuing to evolve. But if we just find sustainable sources of energy, and to your point that there is no deductibility or deduction possible about where the innovation comes from, is there scope for different patterns of food and energy consumption that could continue to keep this huge accelerated pace of innovation going?
Of course, I don't know. I'll just tell you some of my own limited thoughts. We really are confronting in the next 20 years, for the first time, something that is as existential as we've said. And the problem is the global economy, which really is a juggernaut. So here's some thoughts on my part. How could we possibly be sustainably in the biosphere? Well, we were 50,000 years ago. What's happening is the sun shines every year, and for 3.7 billion years, the biosphere has sustained itself and it's evolved enormous complexity with a constant energy input per year. What we have done is we are using fossil fuels, which is dead life. So we are using energy much more rapidly than it's coming in from the sun. My friend Lars Larson points out that we probably use hundreds of times the energy per year than our ancestors did. So we can't keep doing that. Being sustainable on the planet in the long term means roughly, I think, using the energy input and living within that. And the biosphere did fine for 3.7 billion years. We're the ones who were screwing it up. So there are some gifts from TAP. The first one is it's a theory about combinatorial tinkering innovation. We are really good at it. And it is so easy to invent now. I'd like to come back to the issue of poverty. So here is a almost practical dream. The Bible says, don't give the man a fish, give him a fishing pole. So let's go back to about 1730 or 1740 in Scotland. And the enclosures came along. So you couldn't use the commons to raise your sheep. So people were forced off the farms and into the factories for relatively low wages. And it was the start of the Industrial Revolution. So people went from being crofters and making things, a diversity of things with relatively high skills that they traded with one another, as Adam Smith said. Well, okay, so then you have the child labor laws in the UK, and you get Marx and Engels and the toil of the masses. Then Henry Ford invents the assembly line, and we do get a middle class. but people are reduced from making complex things like beautiful furniture, of which I have some in this house from 3 centuries ago, to spending their entire life on a trivial little task like putting on some wheel. So it increases speed of production radically, but it reduced people to doing very routine tasks, which are almost meaningless, and that can now be replaced by robots, which is what's happening. What robots cannot do, Andre and I think we proved it, is robots cannot tinker and innovate. We can. Humans can innovate. So I am falling in love with the following idea. It is, what if we can use Creative Commons around the planet so that people in India and people in Bangladesh and wherever can invent, and if they invent something that will have, you know, a $10,000 market for 7 years or $1 million market for 18 years, we enable people to become inventors, homo tinkerus, as Roger Koppel says. So people are lifted from poverty, not by becoming more enabled consumers, but by becoming enabled inventors. So they are on the production side of the economy, and they maybe get to have some passive income. That's a stake in the game. If we can find a way of doing that, we have returned people to what we are best at. We invent. We do it. We're really good at it. So can we do that so people find meaningful lives in trying to figure out how to invent ways to find meaning in their lives, including practical things like growing food, but art and philosophy and whatever else we're going to do, so that we could be 7 billion people or more, or hopefully a lot less, stably on the planet. I genuinely think, this is going to sound presumptuous, I think Andrea and I are right. We are the third transition in science, where we cannot deduce the world. We live in and participate in the becoming of the world that we cannot control, but we can participate. My moniker for it is that we are of nature, not above nature, and it unleashes into a radical creativity that the biosphere has had for the past 4 billion years. And you will all know this notion of an axial age from 800 to 200 BC. I think we're not too far from a new axial age in which we come to know ourselves as co-creating living members of an ongoing biosphere. I'm not religious, that if we can make a transition from a transcendent God in the Abrahamic world to an immanent God, well, if there's an immanent God, God's still creating. Well, let's create with an immanent God. Along those lines, you're all in India, and I know very little about Indian, except I love Ganesh. How can you not love Ganesh?
So let me just get in one more comment, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
We need to wrap it up in 2 minutes. So 1 minute for the comment, 1 minute for your response, and then we're wrapping it up. So Sudarshan?
Yeah, now, Stu made a reference to macroeconomics. Now, you know, for so many years, Naresh, you and I have been in the United Nations Development Program. The organization pioneered and enriched an understanding of the concept of human development, and advocated that it's possible to improve human well-being. The GDP measures what the economy is doing, but the economy is not people, right? All that. But the big problem for human development as a programmatic agenda has been that we've not developed the macroeconomics that can support it. The macroeconomics that dominates every policymaker in finance ministries around the world is a neoliberal macroeconomic policy. Now, the human development reports have shown that countries with very low GDP have very high human development. Costa Rica was the first country that the report highlighted in the very first human development report. But the entire profession, that the influential part of the profession of economists, go around publishing article after article saying the only way to reduce poverty, the only way to improve education and health, is to increase the GDP of the country, and there will be some kind of a trickle down, and you can do all this when there is equally a solid amount of evidence to show that you can begin at the other end. You can, in fact, increase GDP if you invested in people. But somehow, investment in people, investment in the things that people could do, farmers could do, is not emphasized. The World Bank and the IMF and so on, all the time go on growth, growth, growth. So maybe we should have a bit of a revolution and abolish these institutions. Let the world in different parts try out whatever works for them. Gandhi was always advocating, create your economy in such a way that everything you need is within 100 miles from where you're living, right? So this emphasis that, oh, trade, this, that. So we are up against, so I come back to my point that we are up against powerful forces, and we have to contend with them. And Stu made the point, what will Monsanto do if this happened, right? So let's make that happen, right?
Yep.
So I'd like our university to be a part of it, to play a part. Every drop counts. It's possible. Thank you.
Wonderful.
I'm so glad to hear it. What I love about the idea of local soil restoration is everybody can fall in love with it. It's absolutely practical. It looks like with things like this bioreactor material or others, that's a start. We can understand how to restore the soil, make local communities that, if you're sharing the information in a local community, there's no point in lying. You're like trying to solve a problem, you're not trying to cheat. It becomes as much a sharing gift economy as a sales economy, which we were doing 30,000 years ago. Markets don't do everything. This can be relatively inexpensive. And if it spreads around the globe in the next 20 years, we could in fact shift to polyculture locally. And who knows where that will take us. Yeah. It is, what I love about it is that it is enabling. It's local, it's enabling, it's not laden with power. And I don't think Monsanto and the other big companies can do anything about it. What in fact Andrew Zheng said when I was talking about this peer learning network, he says you've just lowered the transaction costs enormously. 3 farmers in Bangladesh could compete with anybody anywhere. They have access to the information and they don't have to be brilliant rich. So if we're going to create something like the network that some of us are dreaming about, it's doable. The issue will be to have it locally owned. Nobody needs to be making billions of dollars selling its capacities, rather like Wikipedia. It's just there to be used. Well, that's doable.
Thanks.
And what is Monsanto going to do about it? It's going to have to say, oh,
Look, this can go on for a much longer time. This is fascinating stuff. It's getting a little late in India. Many of our students are still up. I'm sure really enjoying this feast of insights and ideas from you, Stu. And it is always a great honor and pleasure for me to engage with you and to listen to your evolving ideas. They keep changing,
Look, Naresh, we are having this conversation that is recognizing that something's not far from being possible, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we are ready to continue our work as you know.
I wanted to raise that with you. Here I am having dinner tonight, trying to reach out to the 12 local communities. And John Crawford is trying to reach out, among other things, to do things in India on large scales.
No, we are ready to link up. We are already working with Annalos Smithsman, who was here, partnering with those experiments, and are going to promote a whole bunch of others.
No, also I must say that we have, and Naresh, you were part of discussions to tackle the problem of pollution. Farmers burning the crop residue because it has no value to them, and they grow wheat and rice, which they shouldn't be doing in this part of the world, right? So I think for our university, in its hinterland to engage with a group of farmers to try out some of these alternative things, which is not going to impoverish them, but which we can, as a university, get some land, demonstrate, have dialogues with farmers. That's what we ought to be doing. So in that sense, we should be part of the network that Stu is talking about. And in as much as I have any say or authority as the Dean of a School of Public Policy, I'd say, please sign me up.
All right.
So the answer is yes. So look, yes. Can we all form some team? We're now connected by email. I would like to talk with you all about getting some of E-Block's beam compost. He's got literally a ton of it. Where around you can some set of experiments be done that's some companion to what we hope to have happen?
Possible.
Absolutely, Stu. I need to wrap this up now. I will ask Sudeep to keep us in that email loop, and we will take this forward. But let me turn to Sudeep now for some concluding remarks, and then we bring this to an end. 2-3 minutes, Sudeep, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so it has been a great, exciting evening. I see that, and I will also hope that my students have also participated, at least kind of listened to all these exciting exchanges. And maybe that when I go back to the class next time, I will be kind of discussing with them. I've already been trying to discuss quite a few works of Stuart and his co-authors like Feline and Roger Koppel and others, of course, Andrea Rowley. I find that the overall view that is really coming up from the exchange between Dean and also Stuart and many others is that this philosophy of participatory realism, because that was this is also the way in which modern science is also evolving. So as Stuart very frankly said that we need to get over Newton. But personally, I will also say that Sir Isaac Newton was a very interesting character. So he was actually not Newtonian. So I mean, Laplace and Hamilton was much more Newtonian than Newton himself. So, but now we have to get over that. And we need to really bring in this participatory realism philosophy more and more into whatever we do, whether we do science or policy making, and that is going to make difference to this way of what we understand about macroeconomics also. Because as Dean very clearly mentioned that till now macroeconomics is understood in a very, very kind of stereotyped and boring way, and that has to really change, that has to really go. So I really thank from the bottom of my heart and everyone's to Stuart Kauffman. Knowing Stuart personally has been a blessing to me and working for quite some time with him. And also I like to thank every family member, I should say, of our school, our university, our CEASP team, CEASP team, and also our IT who was always with us, and our admin team. And I really hope that we continue, to work because this is just the beginning. This is just it was a kind of like knowing each other and where we would like to go. So with Anilois and others, we are already setting up networks. And earlier we also had contributions from Minas and Don Hoffman earlier. So maybe we can extend that networks in those areas too. So thanks a lot from my side and everyone from my family. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot from my side. Naresh, you and I were trying to do this in Ottawa many years ago, and nobody had the faintest idea what we were talking about, right? You will remember about the consensus. I think we're in a position where we can actually start something without heroic effort, but with some serious effort.
Absolutely. Stu, let me just add my word of thanks as well to what Sudeep has said, and do give my love and hugs to Kate, and we will keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Truly, thank you all very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye now. That brings us
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.